would give the distinguished panel a thought to respond to, a somewhat skeptical thought by someone who is the subject of some biographies. This is from Rebecca West. She said, "Just how difficult it is to write biography can be reckoned by anybody who sits down and considers just how many people know the real truth about his or her love affairs." So, how do you sit down to write the life story of any of the people that you've written biographies about? These huge, rich, messy, convoluted lives. Where do you begin?
I'll take the love affairs one because Marlon Brando had so many I lost count after about 100. I don't think, in fact, when you're writing about, at least when I'm writing about an actor or somebody in show business, which seems to be what I've been doing recently, that I'm all that interested in their love affairs. After a while, they resolve into a pattern because, as we all know, people marry the same woman time after time, and women marry the same guy time after time. Rarely does this change, and after a while, I'm much more interested in how they got to what they did, which is, in their case, either creating an individual, as, say, Groucho Marx did, out of nothing. You know, there's this poor kid from the east side of New York whose mother drove him into show business when he wanted to be a doctor, the exact reverse of the usual story. Or Marlon Brando, who was a child of alcoholics and who never really got over that and I think was mentally ill all his life. So how did he get to be an artist? Something he denied all his life. He's never an artist. It's all a con, which is what children of alcoholics feel. So to me, it was much more interesting getting at what I call the soul of a character. And by doing that, I would look at the art, which is the movies or the footage or the radio programs or whatever I could get, and try to construct a life from that. So I think Rebecca West, who had her own love problems and whose son wrote Anthony West wrote a really vicious portrait of her and the marriage or the union with H.G. Wells, is perhaps not the one that I would use as my signal for how to write a book about biography. But anyway, that's my brief answer to that.
In my book, I actually did have to write about a love affair, which was an interesting experience for me. I generally don't wade into people's messy personal and private lives, but to do a book on Brooke Astor and her son and his wife, I really had to spend some time on this. And as some of you who may have followed the fight, as you may know, Brooke Astor's grandson, over 2.5 years ago, Philip Marshall, went to court against his father, accusing him of mistreating Mrs. Astor. And there was a big lawsuit then. Her son, Tony Marshall, was indicted, and he's supposed to go on trial. It was supposed to be this coming Monday. It's been pushed back, but he's been indicted on 18 counts of looting his mother's estate. My book is less a biography to some extent, but it's more about the fight in this family. And one of the things I knew that was a major turning point in this family was when Tony Marshall met his third wife. And he was married, and his soon-to-be wife, Charlene, was also married. She was married to the minister in Brooke Astor's church up in Northeast Harbor, Maine. And I had heard about bits and pieces about this, but when I went up to Maine, it was really one of those kind of experiences as a reporter where you nearly sort of fall off your chair at various points in time. Someone told me that Charlene, the affair was a very public event in the community. It really ripped apart this tiny town because everybody loved the minister, Paul Gilbert, and everybody loved Brooke Astor. And I was curious about how this came together. And at that point, Charlene's ex-husband did later talk to me, but he wouldn't talk to me then. And he had turned me down. Someone I talked to when I was up in Northeast Harbor remembered that he had he'd put together a book of his sermons. And she thought there might be one copy. So we went trailing down to the church. And on a top shelf in the far corner, she found it. And I promptly Xeroxed everything. I didn't have time to read it, and I thought it would be really rude to steal a book from a church. I didn't think that would be a very good thing. and I was curious because, you know, I just had a hunch. Sometimes people write about, sometimes pastors will talk about their personal experiences. And there I was. I had read it all when I got back to New York, and I was in page 72. My wife has left me. He literally wrote, he literally gave this, sermon in front of the congregation talking about how he was distraught and how it was the worst time in his life. And I was thinking, oh, my God, there is a God, as I read this in front of me. And then I had another experience while I was up there. And again, I'm not used to prying into people's dirty laundry, but I also knew that it was tremendously relevant because there was a turning point in Brooke Astor's relationship with his son once he met his third wife, because she was so embarrassed and humiliated. And I was kind of curious about how they got together, how they met. And I was talking to one of Mrs. Astor's very grand friends in the big house up in the hill, and they had been traveling companions. And at the end of the conversation, she said, you know, if you really want to go, you really want to know what's going on in this town, you should go to McGrath's, which is the little shop that sells newspapers in town. You should talk to Dot and Sandy. They know everything. So the next morning, I presented myself at this tiny little store and said, you know, Mrs. Pine tells me that you know everything. And they did, because Sandy had been a cook at Mrs. Astor's house the summer that Tony and Charlene got together. And she was describing how she would get in at 6:45 in the morning, and she would look out the driveway, and she was thinking, what is the minister's wife doing, coming and knocking at the door at 6:45 in the morning, and Mrs. Astor's son is sneaking out? So it rained for the 4 days I was in Northeast Harbor, Maine, and I didn't care.
Well, I think maybe the subtext of the question, or maybe the text of the question is, I think maybe the subtext of the question, or maybe the actual question itself, is really about whether any biographer or any author can actually capture the truth about somebody's life. And if they can't get their love affairs, how can they get any of the rest of it, really? And since they, can get that wrong often, or even if they get it right, it might not necessarily unlock the truth about somebody. And I actually kind of agree with that. I don't think that you can, even in the best biography, right. I think the notion of a definitive biography is a contradiction in terms. I don't think anybody writing about anybody else's life, or even a person writing an autobiography, can be definitive. Human beings are just too complex to do that. So you just try to get kind of as close as the historical record will allow you to get in peeling back the onion. In my case, I didn't want to write a biography, and in some ways maybe then don't belong here tonight, because my book is really more of a slice of Franklin Roosevelt's life. And it ends in late 1933, with the exception of a coda that I put on about his establishment of Social Security and an epilogue. But I was interested in the first 75 pages or so in trying to explain where did he get this extraordinary confidence that allowed him to lift the country out of the fetal position in 1933, when we had a banking crisis that was even worse than what we have today, although in some ways not as complicated. And so I did do some kind of biographical material about the period before that, and I touched lightly on his affair with Lucy Mercer in 1918. And I also included some material, some very, they're love letters between Eleanor Roosevelt and a woman named Lorena Hickok, who was a very talented journalist. And the reason I felt this was a kind of a happy coincidence for me, their relationship became most passionate during the first 100 days. It was actually flowering on my time. It would have been wrong of me, to kind of get this all in the book if it had been taking place at a different time. But it was right in this period. So Eleanor was very distracted during the inauguration, and she and Lorena were together in a room at the Mayflower Hotel on the night before Roosevelt took the oath of office. And their relationship was very complex. I don't come to a conclusion about whether it was physical or not. I decided to just leave that up to the reader, because ultimately it doesn't really matter. They had such an intense emotional connection and felt such love for each other that what happened physically, is of prurient interest, but not central to the story. But their relationship was central in that Lorena encouraged Eleanor to be a totally different kind of first lady, the first lady to ever give a press conference, to write a newspaper column, to travel around the country as the eyes and ears of her husband, perform a central role in giving him the truth about the New Deal. And so the relationship was important for that reason. And FDR's relationship with Missy LeHand, his secretary, which may or may not have been physical, was also very important because Missy was an important advisor and actually helped him pick his attorney general when his original choice, more sex, died of a heart attack a few days before the inauguration when he was having sex on a train with his newlywed, who was about 30 years younger than he was. So I did try to, I mean, you know, sex can kind of pep up a narrative. So I certainly, you know, anytime somebody got drunk or had an affair, I figured out some worthy-sounding excuse to get it into my story.
It is an awfully dirty book, I have to say.
Time after time. Rarely does this change, and after a while I'm much more interested in how they got to what they did, which is, in their case, either creating an individual, as, say, Groucho Marx did, out of nothing. And there's this poor kid. I'll take the love affairs one because Marlon Brando had so many I lost count after about 100. I don't think, in fact, when you're writing about, at least when I'm writing about an actor or somebody in show business, which seems to be what I've been doing recently, that I'm all that interested in their love affairs. After a while, they resolve into a pattern because, as we all know, people marry the same woman time after time, and women marry the same guy.
I would give the distinguished panel a thought to respond to, a somewhat skeptical thought by someone who was the subject of some biographies. This is from Rebecca West. She said, "Just how difficult it is to write biography can be reckoned by anybody who sits down and considers just how many people know the real truth about his or her love affairs." So, how do you sit down to write the life story of any of the people that you've written biographies about? These huge, rich, messy, convoluted lives. Where do you begin?